Good evening, everybody.
Kavod Haraf, how are you?
Baruch Hashem, thank you.
Shavua Tov.
You too, thanks. Okay. Okay, here we go. So, says the tour. Yeah, last time we spoke about the issue of making right these matzot with shapes, and we said you shouldn't do that, right? Now, so continues the tour regarding that. It says, "En osin sekina mitzuyin perush." We already did this. It says, then he says, "Aval kol ma sheosin oto bemasrek כדי שלא יתהפך מותר. כל מקום טוב שלא להשעות עליו לעשותו כמין ציור." So he says, but whatever they're doing, right, in order to avoid that it should it should not become like bloated, right? Swelling, the swelling of the dough. He says allowed. So we have to understand what that means, right? Let's see the Bet Yosef to see exactly what that means. I guess what it means is that they're poking it. There's a certain kind of utensil that pokes it, and it's got like those teeth, and they do that in order to avoid that it shouldn't get bloated up. It shouldn't rise too much. So let's see Bet Yosef how he explains this. So it says Bet Yosef, "Ken katav kolbo," right? That's what it says in the kolbo. וזה לשנו. זה שאנו נוהגים לעשות כאין מסרק לא לציירו, אנו עושים רק לשנותו משאר הפת של כל השנה, וכדי שתאפה יפה, right? So, like if you ever notice, by the way, if you look at the matzot, right, which are, whether they're handmade or a box, they're machine made, they have like these holes, perforations, right, inside of them. If you ever noticed that, and that's what he's talking about here, that he's using this utensil, which puts perforations into the matzah. So he says, we're not doing that in order to make it into a certain shape or something. That's not the purpose. The purpose is that it should look different, distinctive, and also it should bake well. So that helps it to bake better, right? And also to be distinctive, to look a little bit different than the other bread that we make all year round. Interesting. So he says, right, Katav Rabbeinu Yerucham. Yeah, I never really thought about this, why they put those perforations into the matzot. So this is the reason why. כתב רבנו ירוחם, דמוכח בגמרא שאם עבר ועשה סריקין המצוירים ולא החמצו שיוצאים בהם. So he says, right, that another thing that he mentions here is that if he transgressed, right, and he made, right, those shapes, that we talked about. So he says, as long as it didn't leaven, b'diavad, it's mutar to eat that matzah. So, even though lechatchila we said not to do it, but b'diavad it's okay. So what are we talking about? You're making all kinds of, shapes in the matzah, some kind of, right, artistic, forms, whatever, God knows, right, something like that. And you're using something like similar, to make perforations, and those perforations, make it like into shapes, all kinds of shapes. That's interesting. Okay, so yeah, it goes on. Katab Ba'agot Maimon, right? It says also there that Perkei Omer Ritzba, the Kaimalan Rabbi Yosef the Amar, he says, we hold like Rabbi Yossi who says, and Osin Serkin Kemin Rekikin, right? So we're allowed to make, as we said, those perforations like they do with the crackers, פירוש עושים סריקים מצוירים כמין רקיקין דאז אין לחוש לחימוץ כשיית הציורים ועל זה סמכים על לצייר מצות שלנו מפני שאנו עושים אותם כמין רקיקין. So he says, he says we have a custom like that, that we make all kinds of shapes in it. But he says we're not concerned. Why? Because it's done very quickly, So because of that, we're not concerned that it's going to leaven. It's a very quick job, right? So he says dil gada belaz. That's the foreign name for it. Atina shalom basamak. וכתוב באורחות חיים, זה also באורחות חיים, בשם רעה, name of the רעה, דרכו לנקוב הפת כדי שלא יתהפך, right? Again, he mentions this issue of, doing those perforations in the matzah, right? Again, right, he mentions this rabbi the same thing, and he says that the reason why we do that is that it shouldn't, rise too much, right? The dough. So by way of making those perforations, it prevents it from rising, keeps it like flat. Interesting. But tzarich lizaher, so you gotta be careful. שלא ננקוב שתי חלות בכלי אחד. So he says, you know what? Don't do, right? Don't use one utensil, with those perforations, to make two loaves with that. לפי שהאישה שוהה בו, so he says, why is that? Because then, what happens is that there are remnants of the dough left over on that utensil. ומחמצת, and it gets leavened. לפיכך, בעל נפש צריך לשנותו מעוגה לעוגה. So he says, therefore, right, if a person is God-fearing, whatever, so what should he do? He should not use the same one, right? He should have different ones. So each loaf, right, or each, matzah, whatever, gets a different one. So this way, right, there's no concern about these, right, the remnants of the dough sticking on it and becoming chametz. Interesting. These little details, we have here going on. But as I said, you can see, right, in any matzah that you buy, there's always those perforations there. And this is what we're talking about. So it seems to be a custom until this day, to make those perforations. Prevents the dough from, right, getting inflated. That's what we're saying, right? Okay, interesting. Let's go on. וכן צריך לדקדק כשיסדר הפת בתנור שלא ייגעו זה בזה. Another thing he says is that when you put, right, the loaves of matzah into the oven, make sure they're not touching each other. Why is that? לפי שהם לחים עדיין, because they're still moist, he says. When you put them in there, ואין האור שולט בין צידי המפת. So the problem is like this, right, that when you have two matzot sticking one to the other, the heat doesn't get in there, and therefore, could be like left unbaked there. So therefore, so it could become leavened because of that area, because the heat can't get in, because it's covered with one matzah with the other. Again, right, the little details, but these little details do matter, right? Because we want to prevent the matzah from becoming chametz. So what do we got so far, right? We got that the perforations, right, as we said, and we have also that one matzah should not be touching the other, right? And also, right, that you should, when you're making the perforations, he says you should use a separate utensil for each loaf. This way, there won't be any remnants of the dough left over on it. Okay, interesting. Then he goes on, mutar le'afot pat ava b'yom tov. So he says, okay, interesting, right? Another thing he says that you're allowed to make like a thick matzah on Yom Tov. So let's see the tour inside. What he says regarding that. So first of all, right, the Torah says over here, "Mikol makom tov shelo lishot alav le'asato kemin tziur." But it says, right, that we don't want to, right, even though we allow you to make perforations in the matzah, right, as we said, that's a good thing. But what we don't want, is that you should like start making all kinds of shapes on it, some kind of, right, it's like some kind of embroidery there, it's all right. You're making, we don't want that, because then it's gonna stay too long, it's gonna take too much time. And then we're concerned, right, that it's gonna get leavened like that, like playing around, Who has time to make shapes, you know what I mean? Who has time for pictures? Who has time for that? We're now involved, in doing a mitzvah, right? So this is not the time for aesthetics, for all kinds of decorative, right, you know, right, decorative, all kinds of decorative, right, considerations. We don't care about that. As long as it comes out nice and kosher, right? We want it to be kosher. That's the most important thing. So he says, don't go too far with that. You know what I mean? Just like, make the perforations. That's why what you see, right, in the matzot, when they make those perforations, right, they just like, do it like really fast, like in other words, there's no particular shape there. Just like goes in a line, or goes in a circle, whatever. Right? We're not worried about the aesthetics of it. That's not the issue. The issue is to prevent it from, getting inflated, right? From getting too thick, whatever, or too blown up. That's the reason why we do it. Okay, so then he goes on the tour. So as we already mentioned last week, right? A little bit about this. There's different ways of understanding this topic, right? That according to the Rif, Rav Alfas, right? They only forbade when it comes to layman, right? To do these shapes, right? She'enan beki'in b'tziuran. Why b'tziurin? Because the layman, the problem is that he's not expert in doing this, so he's gonna take too long, and then we're afraid it's gonna become chametz. Ve'avor lishot alehem. All right, so therefore he'll, as we said. Aval nachtomin mutarin. But he says when it comes to the baker, he's allowed, right, to make these shapes. Why? Because after all, right, he knows what he's doing. He's very quick, he's very professional. So we're not concerned that he's going to take too long with these things. You know what I mean? He knows how to do it really fast. Okay, good. Uperesh Rabbeinu Yonah. So Rabbeinu Yonah explains the nachtomin mutarin afilu belo defus. So he says, right, that the baker is allowed to do these shapes even without any mold, right? Because the mold, will also, make it faster, right? The process, but he says even if you don't have a mold, right, still it's allowed to do this for bakers. And he says when it comes to the layman at home, right? So there, he's not allowed to do it even if he has a mold, right? So in other words, even though the mold makes it faster, we still don't trust him, to do it too fast. It's going to take too much time. Okay, good. So, Rambam also says the same thing, right? So he says, when it comes to the Rosh, he says, he forbade, whether it's for the layman or for the baker, right? He forbade to make these kinds of shapes and stuff like that. So he was more stringent about it. He didn't care whichever one it was, whether it's a baker or a layman. Mutar lefot pat ava, right? So then we said, now we're getting to our current discussion, right? That was really from last week, this whole thing. We got caught up on the tour here. So then, right, says the tour regarding our current issue, which is right that you're allowed to make thick matzah. B'yom tov and yom tov perush patin gedolim velo chashinan letorach. So it says you're allowed to make them thick, right? And we're not concerned, he says, about the exertion that this requires. Lo shana b'yom tov shel pesach, lo shana b'shar yamin tovim. Whether it's Passover or different yom tov, right? We don't care. So what is he teaching you here? What's the idea? The idea is like this, right? That what do you call it? On Yom Tov, you're allowed to bake. It's true. You're allowed to bake bread. They're having nice fresh bread, right? It's a beautiful thing. Today we don't do it so much. I mean, most of us don't do it. Whatever, there may be some people who do it. Whatever. It's a whole discussion, in itself, by the way, that whole thing about making bread on Yom Tov. But anyway, right, the point is that if you are making the matzot on Yom Tov, so you're allowed to make them thick. So what is that teaching me? Teaching you that even though it's a bigger, hassle to make it like that, it's more work, more labor. And you may think, well, Yom Tov, I should try to diminish my labor as much as possible because, after all, it's a holiday, it's a Yom Tov. So he tells you, no, it's okay, you're allowed to anyway, right? Even though, it's a whatever. As we said, right? That's what he's trying to say. So even though the exertion is more, right? Nevertheless, we allow it. Because after all, you're allowed to bake on Yom Tov, and you're allowed to bake it the way you want, to make it the way you want. It's a part of the process. Okay, so good. ולא שנה ביום טוב של פסח. So then he goes on, רק שלא ילוש ביום טוב של פסח. But he says, you know what? Don't do the kneading, right, on Yom Tov. יותר מכשיור עיסה אחד. So he says, right, what does that mean, don't do kneading? What, you're not allowed to knead? No, that's not what he's saying. You're allowed to knead, but he says, don't do it more, right, than one dough. In other words, don't make them too large, right, as we already mentioned before, right, that you shouldn't make them too big. We said, right, that there's a concern about leavening if you make them too large. So he says, make sure, that you observe that rule, right, and don't make it too large. So as we already said, right, what does that mean, too large? It shouldn't be more than the size of the challah, right? That you're obligated in challah, which we said is 3.5 pounds, right? 1.6 kilo, right? For you European people, right? Whatever. So that's the way it is, and that's what the Torah is saying. Okay, so let's see Bet Yosef here. All right, so says Bet Yosef regarding this, not to make it right, you can make it thick. Per kol shar, right over there, it's in the Talmud, Lamed Vav Amud Bet. And Tan Rabbanan, right, says the rabbis taught there, Enofim pat ava b'yom tov. So according to the first opinion, you shouldn't make thick bread on Yom Tov. Divrei Bet Shammai, right? This is Bet Shammai. Bet Hillel matilin, but Bet Hillel allows. Right? So like what's thick, by the way? Like, the chalot, right, that we make are thick. Relatively speaking, right? It's all relative. As opposed to the pita, or whatever, which is thinner. So you get the idea. There's also something in the middle there, not that thick, not that thin, right? Like the right, the Oriental breads, like the Bukharian bread that we have here, this area, in my area, right? It's like it's not too thick, not too thin, somewhere in the middle, right? It's not a challah, and it's not pita, right? Somewhere in the middle. So yeah. So you're allowed to, right? So there's a machloket between Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel. So Gemara explains, my pat ava pat meruba, right? My tama imishum de katarach tilcha. So it says, what does that mean, thick bread, right? So he says it means it's a large loaf, right? Nice big loaf. And what's the reason? So Gemara asks, if you're going to tell me the reason is because, right, that it's too much exertion, the lo tzarich mai, right? Pesach. What does that mean? What does that have to do with Passover, right? It could be any Yom Tov like that. Right? Afilu b'Yom Tov nami, it says enachi nami. It says the Gemara says, yeah, you're right. It applies to all Yom Tov, not only Pesach. The high Tana b'Yom Tov shel Pesach kaya, but it says they were just happens to be talking about Pesach, but it applies to every Yom Tov. Perish Rashi explains pat merube. What does that mean? Arbe hararim biyachad, but lo mishum chimutz nakatla ubechararim dakim kamar. So Rashi doesn't explain like the way we thought, right? Rashi says when we say, right, to make it thick, which you may think, right, is like thickness, the actual thickness of the bread. Rashi says not like that. Rashi says it's talking about you're making a big batch, in other words, like several loaves, of bread. So, and he says they're not really big. They're not big loaves. So each loaf is really small. They're thin, like pita, whatever. But he says, the problem is that it's just extra exertion. So what does that mean? You're making a lot of bread that you don't really need, so, or whatever, something like that. It's not necessary. You don't need it. Okay, interesting. So says right the Bet Yosef the din ze afa pi she'en makomo kan. So it says even though right really the truth is that this halacha right the place to teach this is not really here. So what does that mean? It's not really particular to the laws of Passover. It could apply to any Yom Tov, So it really should be taught in the laws of Yom Tov, not here. That's what he's saying, right? B'ilchot Yom Tov should be in the laws of K'tur Rabbeinu kan lefi shenimshach achar tana debraita shevio b'inyan Pesach. But he says, so then why did the Tur bring it over here, even though it really should be in the laws of Yom Tov? So he says because since in the Talmud it was mentioned regarding Passover, right, and that's how he brought it here, because it matches up with the with the topic matter, the language and everything. So he put it together. Okay, good. That's the end of the chapter here in the Bet Yosef. So let's see the Shulchan Aruch. No, there's actually more. But anyway, we'll do the Shulchan Aruch. Let's do Shulchan Aruch. We have more stuff to do. So, yes. So says the Shulchan Aruch like this. En osin tzvikin matzuyan dehainu letzer b'pat kamin chaya be'of. So he says, right, that we don't make those, as we said, right, those shaped matzahs, with the designer matzah, right? So what's a designer matzah? That means that he says you have your drawing on the matzah, right? You're making a design with all kinds of shapes of animals or birds, birdies, all kinds of stuff, right? Make it into like a piece of art, decorative matzah, right? As we said, right? So you shouldn't do that lechatchila, as we said, right? Why? As we said, right? The reason is because we're afraid it's going to take too long and it's going to get leavened. You're too worried about artwork. Instead you should be worried about the halachot of Passover. אבל כל מה שעושים אותו במסרק כדי שלא יתהפך, וכל מה שמנקבין המצות מותר. So he says, but you know what? On the other hand, right? If they're using, that utensil, right, which puts the perforations inside right, that's allowed. So we're not doing the perforations in order to make shapes, right? As we said, what's the purpose of it? That it shouldn't blow up, right? It shouldn't get too inflated the dough. Keeps it from getting too airy, right? Whatever. So this is the reason why we do it, and that's okay. You can do that. Does anybody know, by the way, what they call that utensil that they perforate with the dough? I don't know what it's called. Anyway, okay. So whatever it's called. So it says right that you can do, as we said, right? You have the right intention here. This is not for making shapes. This is for practical purposes, to make it more kosher. That's good. וכן מה שמנקבין המצות מותר. בכל מקום טוב למהר לעשותן שלא להשעות בהם. It says, but you know what? Even though we're allowed to make those perforations, right? But he says, do it quickly, like don't now get involved, start getting involved with all kinds of, shapes and symmetry and God knows what, right? It's not artwork after all, so just hit it and perforate it fast and then get into the oven. You know what I mean? We don't want you to wait around and, start doing all kinds of artwork there, as we said. So says the Rama, Yesh la'asot hamatzot rekikin. So this is the Ashkenazi custom, right? So he brings here, right, that you should make the matzot, he says, like, crackers, like, thin, like very thin. ולא פת אבק כשאר לחם. So he says, don't make it thick, right? כי אין הרקיקים ממהרים להחמיץ. So he says, you know why? Because the thin ones, which are like, more like cracker style, right? They don't leaven so fast, but the thick ones, leaven faster. But the truth is, according to halakha, though, right? That's not the halakha. This is the custom of the Ashkenazim. But according to halakha, you're allowed to make the matzah thick. How thick can you make it? One tefach, right? Which is 8 centimeters. You can make it that thick, according to halacha. But the custom of the Ashkenazim is to make them thin, crackery. That's why all the the all the matzot of the Ashkenazim are all hard, and crackers, very thin. So that's their custom. As opposed to the Sfaradim, who make them, softer and a little bit thicker. As we said, right? That's the way the Sfaradim do from many countries, like Iraqis, and also the Yemenites, right? Also the Oriental Jews, they also do that. It's a custom, from these countries, Eastern countries. That's the way they do it. So each country has their own custom. Each community has their own custom. By the way, that brings up a question. What I mean? That the question is, are the Ashkenazim allowed to eat soft matzah? So some people want to say, there are some Ashkenazi rabbis who want to say they shouldn't eat soft matzot, the Ashkenazim. Why is that? Because the Ramah says, right, that the custom is by them is to make them like very thin, like crackers. So they say, right, that it's not really proper for the Ashkenazim to eat that. But the truth is, according to halakha, there's no prohibition. To eat. The Ramah is not saying here that it's not allowed to eat, right? Thick matzah, whatever, or soft matzah, right? What he's saying is that it's preferable by them, by their custom to make it thinner, and which is more like cracker style. And so each community has their custom. But the truth is, it's all kosher. I mean, just a matter of custom. How they make it, each community. Okay, good. So that's the idea. So there's no prohibition, to have soft matzot for Ashkenazim. But some rabbis, in the Ashkenazi community, they discourage eating that stuff. The truth is, because they say it's not our custom to do it that way. Okay, whatever, I can understand that, but there's no prohibition. All right, good. So let's go on a little bit. I think we have more Shulchan Aruch here, and we have more Bet Yosef as well. Right. Right. So now we're going to get to the issue of the thickness, right? As we said. So let's see first the Bet Yosef.
Kavod harav.
Yeah.
How does the custom become the halakha or the other way around?
That's a good question. Yeah, good question. Oh, okay. That's a good question. So there's by the way, when it comes to customs, it's a very big discussion, like if customs are, obligatory or they're not obligatory, or depending on how they came about, what the history of the custom is, how it formed, right? How it was established. There's all kinds of discussions about this, but as a general rule, there's some general rules regarding customs. The general rule is like this, if the custom was made by ignorant people, right? Ignoramuses, which we call amaretz, right, in Hebrew, right? If the custom was made by ameratzot, so that custom is not obligated, doesn't obligate anybody. I mean? We can just like nullify those customs. So the only customs that we really care about is the ones that are made by rabbis, like, the leaders of the community. That's what we really care about. So if the rabbis, the leading rabbis of the town or the country that you live in, they establish a certain custom, so that obligates, the people who live in that country, I mean, to keep that custom, as long as everybody keeps it, I mean? If it's like 50-50, some people do, some people don't, it depends on which side of the street you're on, I mean? If you're on the north side, south side of the boulevard, we're not talking about customs like that. We're talking about custom where the whole city keeps it, the whole town keeps that custom. So then, and it was established by the rabbis, and it caught on. The community likes it, they accepted it. So once that occurs, it becomes like an obligation. You know what I mean? That's the whole thing. So there are rules about that. There's also, rules about when it comes to customs. What about if the custom is against the halakha, right? What about that? So the truth is, most of the poskim say that if the custom is against the halakha, So what does that mean? That there's no like halachic opinion that supports that custom. So then, according to most poskim, the custom should be nullified because it's against the halacha. You know, but there's even like a minority opinion that supports that, so then it's okay. They can stay with it because it was already established by the rabbis. The community took it on, and so forth, so on. Right, so they can stick with that. That's the thing. So there's a lot of rules when it comes to customs. There's a lot of issues that come up and whatever. There's also another issue. Is that when you want to are you allowed to nullify the custom? How do you nullify a custom? What about if you move to a different country, right? What happens then? By the way, I posted, videos about this, about the issue of customs. If you look in my videos, you'll find, right? Like, what's the custom of America? All kinds of things like this. What about when you move to a different country? I covered these things in my videos. So you can look there and get some, good advice on these things. It's quite a complicated issue. It's the issue of customs.
Okay, and so the half of it would be like 50 plus 1. What would we consider half?
I'm sorry. Well, the half of what?
Half if say the community, took upon it, no? And there's
Yeah. So it has to be the whole community took it on.
Okay, 100%.
The whole,
No?
we're talking about 100%.
Okay.
You know what I mean? If it was extended by 100% of the community, more or less, right?
And there's
then it becomes an obligation.
Okay, thank you.
In that place,
Obligation and that place.
In that place, right? As opposed to like another town, which they're not obligated to keep that custom. I mean, they're not. What I mean? So what happens is that since you're only obligated in the place where they have that custom, if you move to a different area, you're not obligated to keep it anymore. You know what I mean? So it depends on the place you live in. What about Florida, right? Like where you live, right? Is there a Florida custom? No such a thing like that. There's 100 different customs in Florida. You know what I mean? So there is no custom in Florida. Just that it's like Ashkenazim and Sephardim. That's everywhere. Like that's that everywhere you go, it's like that. More or less, right? But besides that, there's no real Florida custom. Whatever. By the way, there's also no New York custom. There's also no American custom. No such a thing like that.
Is this because it's the Galut Kabot Harav?
Because there's 100 different customs going on here.
Okay.
You know what I mean? It's not uniform.
Okay.
So you can't tell anybody, oh, why don't you keep this custom, What do you mean? Why? It's only right your neighborhood that keeps that. My neighborhood doesn't keep that custom. Why do I care about you? I don't care. What I mean? Or your shul keeps it, my shul doesn't keep it, So what do I care about your custom? Has nothing to do with me, This is the way it works.
So if somebody who's Ashkenazim goes to somebody who's Sephardic to spend Pesach,
yeah,
how do you reconcile?
you have to keep your customs, even if you're a guest.
Okay.
I mean, when is that? When you're going back to your place. So in other words, you're not going to leave your place and go somewhere else altogether, right? That's already a different issue. But if you're going back to home, right, afterwards, right, most people go back home, right, after they spend Passover. So you do have to keep your customs, So what does that mean? If they're eating rice over there, where so you can, you don't have to care about that, but just don't eat it. I mean, but you shouldn't really care if they have it on the table. What do you care? What's your business? I mean, but you shouldn't eat the rice. I mean, that's the whole thing, right?
Okay, and people keeping 2 days of Pesach here and going to Israel, that is one night.
Yeah, that's also a very complicated issue. A lot of rules about that. I don't want to get into that right now because that would take like a couple of hours.
I'll watch the videos.
I'm sorry. Yeah, that would take a long time, to cover that whole issue.
Okay, I'll watch your videos and I'll look.
Yeah. You can see in the videos. The truth is, I haven't really talked so much about that issue about this issue. I don't think I've talked too much about that But the truth is that there are rules about that as well. There are rules. It's quite complicated. There's also different opinions about that, like everything else. Okay. God
Thank you
bless.
so much.
So, yeah. Okay. Thank you. So it's right. Let's get back to where we were. So it says, um, so says the Bet Yosef here, ותמני איך לא כתב רבנו כאן, had משמע התם דאסור ללוש בפסח פת אבה טפח ורבנו ירוחם כתבו. So he says, right, that Bet Yosef, right, is wondering why the Tur didn't talk here about, making a thick matzah, right? In other words, not too thick, right? So as we said, right, what is too thick? So the rule is, right, it shouldn't be 8 centimeters, right? It could be less than that. In other words, 7.5 is good, right? But 8 or more is not good, right? That's the rule. 8 centimeters is like one tefach. So he says, right, I'm wondering why the Tur didn't bother to write this over here, right? So since he didn't write it, so Bet Yosef brings it, right? He says, well, it still exists, right? So Rabbeinu Yerucham did write it. Okay, so let's see the Shulchan Aruch regarding that. The thickness of the matzah, right? So it says in Shulchan Aruch, "En osim bepesach pat arba tefach," right? So as we said, right, you shouldn't make it 8 centimeters. Less than that is okay. Why 8 centimeters? Because this is like your fist. The thickness of the length of your fist, like this, right? That's 8 centimeters on the average, right? The median fist, right, is like 8 centimeters, right? So don't make it that much, right? Less than that is okay. 7, 6, 5, whatever, right? It's okay. That's the way it is. Nobody makes it that thick today, as you know, right? Everybody makes it like very thin. Even the Sfaradim, who make it a little bit thicker than the Ashkenazim, but it's still quite thin. I mean, it's like it's not even like half an inch. I mean, the Sephardi matzah. So it's very thin also. But it's like a pita. It's soft. But quite thin also. So nobody really makes thick matzot anymore. It's a lost art. Whatever. It doesn't exist anymore. This whole thing. Okay, whatever, right? But the truth is that the Sephardi, the soft matzot are like thicker than the Ashkenazi. That's for sure. But not that much, really. Not a big difference there. Okay, so that's right. That's the Shulchan Aruch. So we have one more. Let's see if we can finish it before we break off for tonight. I think that's the end of the chapter too. So let's see what we can do here. Right, it seems like it's pretty short, I think. Oh, there's also there's two more. Okay, I thought it was only one more. So anyway, let's try to do at least one more. So it says, "וכתוב באורחות חיים, אין להקל במה שהחמירו הקדמונים שלא לעשות פנדיש או פלאוניש." Right? Oh, right. It says don't be lenient. That which was already established by the earlier rabbis, right? In other words, here is an example of your custom question, right? So they made this custom, the rabbis, not to make these types of things, pandish and ploundish, right? The thing is, right, we have to know what it is. He doesn't define what it is here. So let's see if the Shulchan Aruch does define what this is, so we can know, right, to be careful not to make this stuff. Okay. So it says, right, right? So these are like names which are, from old languages, probably, I don't know, God knows which language this is, right? So let's see if the Mishnah Berurah explains it here, right? Our resident translator here, the Mishnah Berurah, hopefully he'll translate it for us. Okay, here we go. Yeah, I think he does. So it says Mishnah Berurah, Hen isot matzot memulaot bebasar o begvina. Okay. So he says, right, what are these? These are like, matzot that you make, right, which have a filling inside, like with right meat inside there or cheese, right, things like this. So the earlier rabbis have established a custom, right, not to make this stuff, right. So the question is why, right? What's so bad if there's a filling inside the matzah? Right, we have foods like this, in our times, like, we're like, calzone, right? Things like this, right? A calzone is like a dough, has inside their filling, right? Whatever is inside there, cheese, whatever, mozzarella, whatever, right? That's what we're talking about, right? So why is it so bad to make the matzah like that? So says Mishnah Brura, לפי שבשעת אפייה יוצא ליחה מהבשר והגבינה, ומלכלך את העיסה ומעכב את אפייתה. So he says the problem is like this, that when you're baking this, right, kind of, filling, matzah with filling inside, your matzah calzone, right, whatever you want to call it, right? Your boreka, right, whatever, matzah boreka. So the problem is that the moisture, as the cheese melts, or the meat, right, the fat melts there. So it saturates the dough with the fat. And what happens is that it cannot be baked well, he says, right, because of that. It doesn't get baked well because of the moisture, from the cheese or from the meat. And therefore, right, we're afraid, of leavening. Again, right, we have the same problem here. So therefore, right, says the Mishnah Brura, right, this is the reason why we don't make these kinds of things. It's a good thing you explained it, right, because otherwise we wouldn't know what it is. Okay, somebody's got to do it. Okay. Okay, so he brings here also other things, whatever, other considerations. But I think we got the idea, right? So don't make your matzah calzone or your matzah boreka, right? We don't want that. Right? Your matzah cheesecake, right? Whatever you want to make, those things, right? We don't want that stuff. Okay, so right, that's the Vav, right? And we have one more. Let's see if we have time. I don't know. Let's see if we have time to finish one more. Otherwise, we'll leave it for tomorrow. Let's see what we got here. Seems like it's pretty short. So I think we should just finish it off. With your permission. Okay, so is this way we can start a new chapter next time? So says Bet Yosef here. Yeah, it's pretty short. כתב עוד שם, אסור ליתן ביצים של ימים בפת ותאפה מהם, שהרי יוצא מהם ליחה ומעכבת. So he says the same thing also applies, right, to putting eggs inside there, putting a filling it with eggs, ואפילו אם הביצה מבושלת, he says, even if the egg is already boiled, right, it's already cooked. So he says the problem is that, these fillings, right, even the filling with eggs, also, prevents it from baking properly. This is the problem. So when it doesn't bake properly, what are we concerned, right? That it's going to get leavened. That's the thing, right? So it says the same thing also applies. He says some say it also applies to all kinds of seeds, and any kind of filling, which can do this kind of problem. You go on the shomer, right? So he says, right, I guess he means shomer, maybe like poppy, poppy seeds, whatever, all kinds of things like this. So the thing is, right, try to avoid, making matzah with filling, right? This is not the time for that. We'll say that for a different time, right? Different season. Don't make matzahs with fillings, right? Whether it's eggs or, or poppy seeds or, God knows what, right? Whatever, right? So let's see the Shulchan Aruch. It's very short, right? Let's just see what it says there. Let's see. And it says we said, right? Don't put eggs in there, he says like a complete egg, like a full egg, right? And bake like that, because as we said, right, this prevents the dough from baking properly, right? It's like, forms some kind of a partition there, with all the fat, and all the the yolks and the right, all that stuff that's in there in the eggs. So we don't want that. So try to avoid it. Okay, very good. So just wanted to remind you, right? Last week we talked about the issue of baking the matzah with the dough with spices. So just wanted to I already texted you guys after the lecture, right, the last time. But just to review, right? The point is like this: that when it comes to pepper, right? So even bediavad, right? If you made matzah with pepper, in the dough, you cannot have that, right? That's what we said, right? It's forbidden. What about salt, right? So according to Shulchan Aruch, lechatchila, you shouldn't make it with salt. But b'diavad, you can have it, if you made it with salt. But the Ramah says you should not have it, b'diavad. So there's a machloket there between the Ramah and Shulchan Aruch regarding the salt. Right? What does that mean, b'diavad, if you're allowed to have it or not? When it comes to other spices, right, the rule is that lechatchila, you shouldn't put any spices in there, right? But b'diavad, you can eat it if you made it like that. That's what it says in Shulchan Aruch. So so that's why, right? Basically, because of this, right? Nobody puts spices in the matzah, right? Nowadays, nobody dares to do such a thing like that. Whether it's salt or pepper or any other spices, right? Nobody puts it in there because we want to be on the safe side, right? For Passover, right? We want to be kosher, glad kosher, right? So therefore, we try to avoid everything. But as we said, right? B'diavad, if you made it with spices, it's still kosher, the matzah, b'diavad. So right, that's the rule. Okay, God bless you. Thanks for coming. Be blessed with wealth and health and happiness. We'll see you tomorrow, Reza Hashem. I heard some good news tonight. That they're killing a lot of Nazis over there. They had a big strike last night. So it's good news, Baruch Hashem. They're killing Nazis, wiping out the Amalek over there, right in the south. Then they have to go back to the north, right? Wipe out the Amalek over there. Amen, man. And we'll see you tomorrow, Reza Hashem. Chazak Baruch, Laila Tov.
Kavod Harav, thank you so much.
All the best.